Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a new podcast about how much money movies make at the box office. This episode is going to be a weekend review. We're going to talk about the last weekend, the Halloween weekend of October 28th through the 30th, and sort of walk through the top 10 films, and then do a deep dive on the single wide release of last weekend, which was Inferno, which turned out to be an absolute flop. So let's walk through the top 10 first. Coming in at number 1 was Boo, a Madea Halloween with $17.2 million on only 2,300 theaters, which is fantastic, with a per theater average of $7,500. That is fantastic for a second weekend. It's just great. Now, Madea, Boo, a Madea Halloween definitely surprised people on its first weekend. I don't think a lot of people expected it to beat Jack Reacher, or the Jack Reacher 2, Never Go Home. Was that what it was called? Never Go Back, whatever, same thing. In any event, Boom Madea Halloween did great last weekend, came in at 28.5 million, and took the number one spot. And the second weekend, I didn't think it was going to drop that much, and it didn't at all. So a normal drop, you're talking 45 to 55%, somewhere in that range. Anything below 45 is really good. Anything above the 55, you're talking problems. And Boo came in at just about a 40% drop, which is fantastic. And that per theater average of $7,500, would be good. That would be a decent first weekend per theater average. And the fact that it's making it on the second weekend is great. Now, some context here as to why Madea is doing so well its second weekend. One, it's the Halloween weekend. So it's a Halloween movie. It did really well its first weekend. Its second weekend, it's going to still be part of the cultural experience of the Halloween, right? People are going to go to a Halloween movie. Madea's out there. The other option is a Ouija, and that's it. You got two choices. And for some reason, Boo really captured the culture this year. And if people wanted to see a Halloween movie, they ended up going to Madea. I don't know why. Deadline had a great little paragraph about the audience for this new Madea movie and how it not completely changed, but significantly widened its audience outside the African American demo. Normally for a Madea movie by Tyler Perry, you're going to see an audience total of about 80 to 90% that's African American. Now, with this Boo movie, the first weekend, I think, was a little bit lower. I can't remember the exact figure. I want to say 70, 60% was African American. But the second weekend, it really opened up, and the African American demo dropped below 50%. I want to say it was in the 30% range for this movie. Now, I don't know how accurate those numbers are. I think it's through ComScore Post Track, I believe is what it's called. I don't know how accurate that is, but it's a really interesting insight anyways, that the reason that the new Madea movie, Boo, is doing so well is that it's sort of transcending the African American demographic. So really interesting stuff. Really great performance by that film. I guess Tyler Perry is going to get like a blank check now to do new movies, because I think this is going to end up being one of his top performers, especially in recent history. And I don't know if it's going to go down as his most best performing film, but certainly one of. Coming in at number 2 for the weekend was Inferno with $14.8 million on a huge wide release of about 3,600 theaters. Its per theater average was only about $4,200. Wow. I don't even know where to begin with this. We're going to do a deep dive a little bit later as to what happened here. As you recall from last week's projection episode later in the week, I said Inferno was going to, I don't know if I said massively underperform, but I said significantly underperform at the mid 20s. I think that I said 25.5 million. I think that's what I said. I should probably write those things down, right? In any event, definitely low to mid 20s is my projection. That was outside of what a lot of experts were saying, which was higher 20s to low 30s. And even 2-3 months ago, the projections for Inferno were higher than that, in the 30s. And the reason why The projections were that high is if you look back at the former films in this series, Angels and Demons and the Da Vinci Code. You're talking Da Vinci Code opened at $77 million, took home $217 million total domestic, a lot more international. Angels and Demons opened up at $46 million and came in at $133 million domestic. So there was an expectation there that while Inferno, opening 9 years after Angels and Demons, 7 years after Angels and Demons, was going to be a little bit of a lower performer. Dan Brown books aren't that popular or as popular as something like the Da Vinci Code was in the mid 2000s. So I think analysts saw it as like, all right, it's not going to do those numbers, but it's still a Ron Howard film. It's still starring Tom Hanks, and it's still based on a book that is a multi-million-dollar selling book. So you would expect it to have a little bit of a pop on opening weekend for a major release. And boy, did it underperform. A $4,000 per theater average would not be terrible for an unknown property, maybe like a comedy that had a couple of good stars, and you would say, that's all right. That's kind of a middling performance for that movie. But when you have a wide open blockbuster with an A-list star and an A-list director based on a known property that is super, super popular, this performance is absolutely dreadful across the board. This is a terrible, terrible performance. 10 million below what I said, and my projection was at least 5 to 10 below the industry wide projections for Inferno. So Inferno was a total dud, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the show, because I do find it quite fascinating how poorly it did. And I think it says a lot about the film industry right now, and a lot about Ron Howard and Tom Hanks and where their careers are going. But before we get to that, let's walk through the rest of the top 10 here. Coming at number 3 was Jack Reacher, Never Go Back. It's the Tom Hanks sequel to the original Jack Reacher. Came in at $9.6 million on about 3,800 theaters, and only a $2,500 per theater average. That is bad. The second weekend here for Jack Reacher, not good. It dropped almost 60% from its opening weekend. What that tells me is you got a quality problem, essentially. People didn't like the movie. Critics didn't like it. Came in at 38% Rotten Tomatoes. Audience score on Rotten Tomatoes was, I think, a 51% liked it. Cinema score was a B+. Remember, Cinema score is essentially A+ to a B- scale. Anything below that is essentially failing. So Jack Reacher came in with a B+, sort of middling, not great, not terrible, but not good. Certainly not good. And the drop on the second weekend of over 60% sort of proves that. So unfortunately, Jack Reacher is probably not going to come back for a third movie. It'll end up probably around $60 million total domestic on this run if it keeps dropping like this. Coming out number 4 last weekend was The Accountant. This is the Ben Affleck spy movie. I guess he's a spy. I guess he's a hitman. I know he's an accountant. In any event, came in at $8.4 million last weekend on 3,400 theaters, about a $2,500 per theater average. It's its third weekend. Total gross so far, $61 million. Not too bad for that film. Not too bad at all. Coming at number 5 last weekend was Ouija, Origin of Evil. This is the sequel to the 2014 horror movie Ouija, which everybody hated. I have not met a single person who thought that movie was decent. The cinema score was like a C. People just absolutely hated it. And I think I talked about this last weekend, but the cinema score was also a C for this, but it doesn't make any sense because critics gave it like an over an 80% on Rotten Tomatoes, and audiences seemed to like it a lot more. So I think the cinema score on that was pretty skewed. In any event, sequel to Ouija, Origin of Evil made $7.1 million last weekend. A nice little 50% drop, which is really good for a horror movie. But remember, it was Halloween weekend, so it's a little bit skewed there. It probably would have dropped like 55, 60 if it was a normal second weekend for this horror film. 3,200 theaters, about $2,250 per theater average. So far, it's about $25 million total. The budget was only $9 million for this. Obviously, the marketing budget was way beyond that, probably $40-50 million alone for the domestic market marketing on this. Maybe less because you didn't see a ton of it. But I do think we might see another sequel here to Ouija. It might end up being like the Saw series where we see a new Ouija every Halloween. If they keep performing at this level, it's not like outstanding, but it's certainly not terrible by any stretch of the imagination. Coming at number 6 was The Girl on the Train. This is the Emily Blunt movie based on the best-selling book. Came in at $4.4 million. A nice little 39% drop. That's great for this movie. And its total so far is $66 million. And that's its 4th weekend. I think this is kind of I think it's a success. I don't think it's anywhere near as successful as they thought it was going to be. They definitely wanted Gone Girl numbers for this film. They're not going to get it at all. But I don't think you could call it a failure by any stretch of imagination. I think it's gonna make some money back for Universal. So that was number 6. Number 7, Home for Peculiar Children, the Tim Burton movie, came in at $4 million on its 5th weekend. Total gross so far is $80 million. This is another one where I feel like it is probably closer to a flop than not, but not an epic flop like the domestic total for Inferno so far. Coming at number 8 was Keeping Up with the Joneses, $3.4 million in its 2nd weekend now. Only $10.8 million total so far. Really bad performance for this film. I think Fox wanted this to do much, much better than it's doing. This is the Zach Galifianakis comedy with Isla Fisher and Don Draper and Wonder Woman. I don't remember their names. That's how I remember them as their characters. Anyway, Keeping Up with the Joneses is not doing very well at all. Number 9, Storks, the children's film from Warner Brothers, at $2.8 million. A great 29% drop. It's starting to drop a lot of theaters, too. It's only at 1,900 theaters now. And it's 6th weekend with a total of $68 million. So pretty good for that film. Kind of sticking in there. I thought it would do a lot more than that overall. Just because of, I don't know, the children's market, it's animated. It just felt like it was going to break 100, but it's not going to. Coming at number 10 was an Indian film that wasn't really a wide release, technically. It was only released on 300 theaters last weekend. Ad Dil I Muskil. I probably butchered that name, but that's the way it goes. Came in at $2.2 million on 300 screens. Come on. I mean, that's a $7,250 per theater average. Really fantastic. I'm surprised that I didn't hear anything about it in any of the box office press that I was reading, but it may just be, an Indian market film and it plays to Indian Americans and that's who went to see it. And I kind of wonder if it's going to stick around. I wonder if that per theater average is going to drop 50% next week or, 80%. I'm not really sure how it's going to act, so I'm going to keep my eye on that one just for interest's sake. So interesting top 10. Boo won out the weekend. Jack Reacher, middling performance. The Accountant sticking around. We might see another Ouija because the sequel's doing well. But the big story last weekend is definitely going to be the underperformance of Inferno. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive on that and trying to figure out what exactly happened. So last weekend, I projected it at, I think, $25.5 million. So mid-20s, essentially. It ended up at $14.9 million. So I was about $10 million off, right? So maybe I should be kind of upset about that or pissed off that I was that wrong. But I think I got the trend right. And the trend was that this movie was not going to do well. Analysts about a month ago were saying low 30s, mid 30s. 3 months ago, 6 months ago, you probably would have said high 30s, low 40s, something like that. When looking at this series of films, so Inferno is based on a Dan Brown book. It is the 3rd Dan Brown book movie that's been made by the team of Ron Howard and Tom Hanks as the lead of Robert Langdon. You would expect this movie to do okay. You wouldn't expect it to flop like it did last weekend, only making almost $14.5 million essentially. Now, the original Da Vinci Code came out in 2006. Did $217 million domestic, opened at 77. It wasn't going to do those numbers. Angels and Demons came out in 2009, opened up at 46, ended up at 133. You didn't really expect it to do those numbers either, although you could argue that those were possible. That was in the realm of possibility that would do 40s. And I think about 6 months ago, that's what people were thinking. Maybe low 40s, maybe high 30s. And then those projections kept going down and down and down. And I felt like my projection last weekend of $25 million was kind of on the lower end of what people in the industry were thinking. And for that movie to do $10 million less than that is terrible. And, if we kind of take a closer look at what happened, the first thing that we can look at is, what do the critics say about Inferno? What happened with the critical response? The critical response to Inferno was savage. It came in at 20% on Rotten Tomatoes. And I knew something was off about this film because one of my favorite critics on the BBC did because this movie opened internationally a while ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago even. And so they had the reviews up first, and he just laid into this film. And he's a very even-handed reviewer, very sort of more of the intellectual side of the reviewer, not really a pop critic, more like an art critic. And the way that he dissected this film, and he wasn't unfair to it, I don't say whatsoever. He just wrecked this film to pieces. And so I knew that this was not going to be a hit in terms of its multiplier or people coming back to see it multiple times. This was a one and done film that people who read the book would probably see, and not that many more people than that. And that's why I projected it to be on a little bit lower end of things, because of that quality of a film, that poor quality of a film, that gets out to people nowadays, and they know before they go whether this film's going to be decent or not. And the cinema score on this film was a B+. And again, A to C is essentially the range, C being a failing grade. B+ is not great, but it's certainly not terrible. But when you look at the audience reviews for Inferno on Rotten Tomatoes, it only gets a 43%. So I think the overall message here is people just didn't like the movie. Now, does that really explain why it did so pathetically on opening weekend? And it doesn't, because quality will affect opening weekend to some degree. But the way that this movie faltered, there's something else going on here. And I think that, a lot of it has to do with the marketing of the film and the timing of the film. Now, you take a look at the marketing. The trailers were tepid at best. They felt flaccid. There was nothing going on in them that felt exciting or interesting whatsoever. There was no hook. It felt very blasé, the whole thing. It almost felt like Ron Howard and Tom Hanks just wanted to take a vacation with a beautiful young woman, Felicity Jones. I'm not implying anything. I know they're both married men with children. In any event, that's kind of what it looked like, though. It looked like just like a travelogue film where these, really good actors decided to go to Italy or Austria or wherever the hell they are in the movie and just shoot some stuff. And there's a plot going on, but nobody really cares. It just seemed so unimportant and uneventful. And that was just the marketing side of things. I heard a lot of people online say they didn't know this movie was coming out. I think that's because Sony spent a lot of money marketing this movie internationally. Now, Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons both had a kind of weird international to domestic split in terms of its market share. So they both had a 30% domestic share versus a 70% international share. That's pretty weird. Normally we're going to see like a 45% domestic to 55% international. If it's a bigger blockbuster that's playing big in China, you might see like a 40 to 60 breakdown. But a 70 or 30% domestic to 70% international breakdown is pretty abnormal. So I think a lot of the marketing dollars for Inferno actually went to the international audiences, and it seems to be doing all right internationally. I honestly don't know enough about the international markets, and I don't have enough numbers in front of me to really figure out if it's collapsing like it is on the domestic market. But like $14.6 million domestically for a film like this is a disaster. This is not underperforming. This is just a pure flop. And it's sad for a few reasons. It's not sad because Dan Brown's a great author. I think a lot of people, it's essentially airport fiction. A lot of people like his books. They're interesting. They're quick reads. There's some weird historical kind of interesting facts in there. So the the literary qualities of the books aside, it is kind of sad because this is Ron Howard's fourth flop in a row. And I realized that this, and I talked about this last week a little bit, how he just has not had a real big hit in a long time. And this became kind of a meme today and yesterday among non-box office nerds. And I know that because it was a trending post on Reddit, the R Movies subforum, which is kind of honestly a shit show of a place. I go there all the time just to see what's going on, and it's kind of fun to take part in the whole circus of that subreddit. But there was a post on there today that I think reached 5,000 likes or something like that. That was a post of a New York Times article with the title, "Inferno is director Ron Howard's fourth domestic flop." This is huge for box office news. You don't usually see articles like this. Number one, being printed by New York Times, the newspaper of record, as they say, but then also going viral on Reddit. There's something here. There's some cultural importance to this moment for Ron Howard. I think we all know Ron Howard as a great director. Obviously, he was a child actor who became famous and then transitioned into a production director role later in his career. And he's done fantastic work. No one's going to take that away from him. But when you look at his recent career, you see nothing but floppage. Just nothing at all but flops all the way back to Angels and Demons. And if you go back even further and you think about it in terms of his more original works outside of the Dan Brown series, he really hasn't had a runaway hit since A Beautiful Mind 15 years ago in 2001. So what does that say? Like, what does this all mean about Ron Howard? Like, what's going on with this guy? He's in his 60s now. He did a really wide open interview with Mark Maron on What the WTF podcast this week, which I found just fantastic. Great to listen to. He was really honest about his life and his career. Had a ton of great stories. But I think Ron Howard is definitely the byproduct and grew up in the old studio system. And when I say old studio system, I mean the pre-70s New Hollywood era of the film industry. It's funny, on that podcast, he talks about getting his start working with Roger Corman, the infamous B movie director of that time period, who gave a head start to a lot of young guys like Francis Ford Coppola, I believe, got started through him, and a lot of other people. So he was part of a little bit of that counterculture movement that was going on in the 60s and 70s, but he always seemed to play against it. And throughout his entire career, his movies have been what I would call kind of all-American type films. They're not edgy. They're not social criticism, at least blatant undercutting social criticism that's cynical. His movies tend to have a very positive, warm outlook to them. And I kind of wonder if there's a place for Ron Howard's type of filmmaking anymore. And I don't necessarily mean the types of films he makes in terms of the genre. He can make films across many different genres. That's one of his talents, actually. He can do historical drama. He can do international thrillers like Da Vinci Code. He can do fantasy like Willow. What's really Willow actually a good film? Does anyone remember? I just have very good memories of it as a child. And I think it's sort of grown in its stature since the 80s. Because in the 80s, I felt like it was treated as this, not even a cult film back then, but more of this sort of throwaway fantasy film that happened. But I think people really like the film. Anyway, Ron Howard's an all-rounder. He can do production, he can do acting, he can do writing, he can do directing. He is definitely a very powerful person in the industry, but I do wonder if his tone and style has just waned in the last 15 years since Beautiful Mind. Now, if that movie came out now, would it have done as well as it did back in 2001? I think the answer is absolutely not. Ron Howard's style just doesn't fit in with the culture anymore. He's too nostalgic. He's not cynical enough. Young people nowadays, and remember, the number one going per capita age group of moviegoers is 12 to 17. Would they get something like A Beautiful Mind? or Cinderella Men or Far and Away. I think about Far and Away especially, so overcooked, everything about it. But that's what kind of makes it fun. It's just like almost like a fantasy level of historical drama. Super outrageous, but there's something appealing about that. And maybe that's because I grew up in the 90s and grew up on that film. But I don't know if young people today and people under 30 can really be attracted to his films anymore, and his style. I think it's a little bit too old school. Now, Rush is, one of those exceptions. I think you go on Reddit and you mention Rush in the movie subreddit, and people will be like, "Oh, it's an amazing film, amazing film." But again, didn't do very well. So you gotta have to wonder: is Ron Howard's style just tired and boring, or is Ron Howard just choosing the wrong works to focus on? Like Rush, I've already mentioned here, is kind of a cult hit. Formula One is not popular in the United States. Not a lot of people watch Formula One racing. So kind of a bad move in terms of the choice of topic there. And The Heart of the Sea came out last year, December. Not even a year ago. Everybody's completely forgotten about this film that ever existed. And if you watch the trailers to that movie, okay, it's an historical drama at sea, but it involves a whale. Wait, so is it Moby Dick? No, it's something else. Then what is it? It looks just like Moby Dick. It was so utterly confusing on every level about what that film was like. And I just don't think young people are into it at all. So I think, Ron Howard has just had a bad luck in two ways. One, he's choosing the wrong movies to make. And two, his style just doesn't translate well anymore. I think the last movie that he had that really connected with audiences was definitely Beautiful Mind. And I mean mass audiences. Obviously, Rush was kind of a cult hit now. I'm not saying that he's making bad movies. I'm just saying he's not choosing the right works to make. And that's compounded by his old school style a little bit, and as to why people are rejecting his films. So Inferno was a disaster. I hope it makes back some of its money internationally. It's probably going to be a 30 to 70 split, like Angels and Demons and Da Vinci Code. And I think Ron Howard gets hurt the most here, right? Sony to a lesser extent. Tom Hanks is Tom Hanks. He's not going to have any problems finding movies. Felicity Jones is going to be in the biggest movie of the year, Rogue One, the Star Wars movie coming out in a couple of months. She's not going to have any problems. And I just think the Dan Brown series, Robert Langdon series, is over in terms of films. And Ron Howard really has to find a different path. In that interview on Mark Maron's show, I came away with definitely a new sense of respect for him. He seemed to have been through so much in his life in terms of his career and being in Hollywood. He has to be one of the most knowledgeable people in that industry. And it's kind of sad to see him go 0 for 4 in the last 7 years now in terms of the films that he's making. There are a lot of poor choices there. Like, why would you do The Dilemma with Vince Vaughn and Kevin James? Like, with that movie so far beneath Ron Howard's talent that it's no mistake. It's no wonder it was a total flop. Like, no one would want to see that movie. Obviously Rush was pretty good. In the Heart of the Sea, no one wants to see a movie like that. I don't know, why would you make a movie like that? Who's greenlighting that movie? And also, who greenlit Inferno? Angels and Demons did far less money than Da Vinci Code. I think it was like $300 million less internationally. Clearly, there was no more expanding market for these types of movies. And the Robert Langdon series probably should have just been left for dead then. But they wanted to come back and make more money. But it's 7 years later. Like, no one cares about Dan Brown books anymore. And if they do, they're not going to go see the movies based on them. Because the last two ones weren't really that good. So, it's a confluence of a lot of different things going on here in terms of Inferno's failure. And I think the bigger implications outside of Ron Howard's career are the fact that movie studios are still banking on intellectual properties that are old and tired, but easy to make films off of. Like, I'm sure there was a meeting over at Sony about this film, and it was like, well, Ron wants to do it, Tom's in on it, we'll get some new young Hollywood starlet like Felicity Jones to be on board, And look, the book sold however many million dollars in copies. It's a no-brainer, right? But the world doesn't work that way anymore. Not necessarily like it did 15 or even 10 years ago. Hell, even if you looked at the last 5 years, the way social media has been growing and just becoming an every day, every minute part of our lives, culture has just changed a lot. So I don't think the way that studios decided to make movies works anymore. And I'm not trying to sort of criticize the studio system and how it's working now. It's that they are in a situation now where it is open competition like it's never been before. Netflix, Amazon Studios, and there's probably 10 more companies that are being started right as we talk right here that are going to take them on. And unless they figure out how to connect with the younger people and the different demographics that exist that go to see films, and they do it well, they are going to fail. And Inferno is an example of a failure. It was lazy across the board. It was a lazy business decision. It was a bad business decision. I mean, at the end of the day, no one could tell me that they went through due diligence when greenlighting this film. There's just no way. I'm sure it was some producer at Sony or whoever, maybe Ron or maybe Tom, basically said, hey, let's make another one. And someone said, okay. You know, I wonder if studios have like risk management teams that are like, no, this is actually a terrible idea based on these different criteria. I know we know as amateurs and lay people, we can always sit on the outside of the industry and be like, oh, you should have done A, you should have done B. But there are certain situations like this film where it is so obvious that it was a bad decision to move forward with it, that you do have to wonder about the efficiency of the studio system and how it's working, especially now with the new realities of the upstarts and the upstart studios. I'm not even just talking about Netflix and Amazon Studios. I'm talking about companies like A24 who are producing films of very high quality for very little money and are now competing with these major studios. Now, they're not making huge blockbusters for $150 million or $250 million. But anything, below the $50 million range, they are competing on that level with them. And it's only a matter of time before one of these upstarts starts making those leaps up to the $50 million and $100 million production budgets. Because if they're doing it better and people want to see their films, they're going to win. And I think that's one thing that I'm noticing from this poor performance of Inferno is it suggests that the major studios are having a hard time adjusting to the new reality of film entertainment and the business. They defined the business 15, 20 years ago. Now consumers are defining it in a way that they haven't ever done before with the movie industry. And we've seen this happen in music over the last 20 years. I think music was probably the first domino to fall. And look at where music is at now. I pay $11 a month for Spotify and get every single song basically ever recorded on the history of time. And it's like that versus 1999, which was only 17 years ago, which is when CD sales were at their height. And the average CD was like, $15. Like that discrepancy in business models or that collapse of a business will happen to the film industry. And I think, a movie like Inferno is a canary in the coal mine. Studios have to get a lot more efficient and a lot more dogmatic with how they vet ideas, because if they let a movie like this get out, I'm not going to say Inferno is going to lose a ton of money, but it's certainly not going to make a lot of money. And if there's another studio out there who's making a film with a better return on investment, they're going to win. And the studio like Sony's is going to get left in the dust a little bit. But I could rant about this for hours upon hours. Inferno was a disaster. Did very poorly. Ron Howard's career is basically on ice right now. Like, he has to find a way to come back with maybe a smaller film, maybe an art film, in order to sort of keep getting the green light on the budgets that he wants for bigger films. And that's if he wants to keep going. He's in his 60s now, so he might just retire. But I don't think that he will. I think he wants to come back and make another movie like Beautiful Mind or something like that, and sort of go out with a bang with his career, kind of like or maybe like Clint Eastwood, and never really retire. In any event, I will be back later this week to talk about the 3 new openers this weekend. I'm really excited about trying to do some projections for these. Doctor Strange, Hacksaw Ridge, the Mel Gibson movie, and Trolls is coming out on Friday this week. I'm sorry, Thursday this week. So I'll do a little rundown of my projections later this week. Probably do an episode on Thursday. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys. This has been the Wildline Podcast. I've been your host, Dan.